Welcome students. Now we are going to discuss the Carvaka materialism, one of the philosophical systems. In this session, we shall deal with the only one materialist philosophy in ancient India propagated by the Carvakas. It will be interesting to see how strong and radical were the views and how the dominant schools had reacted to their attack on the spiritualism and ritualism prevalent in their times. We shall discuss in detail the metaphysical, epistemological and ethical positions of their philosophy, widely known as Logayata. Now we will introduce the subject. The school of classical Indian philosophy are classified into two, namely the orthodox and the heterodox, otherwise known as Astika and Nastika systems, are the technical terms in philosophy for the orthodox and the heterodox schools respectively. The orthodox school include those which accept the authority of the Vedas. By this definition, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Purvamamsa, Uttaramimamsa or Vedanta are classified as Astika schools. The schools that do not accept the authority of the Vedas are termed heterodox. The heterodox schools are mainly three: Logayata or Carvaka, Jainism and Buddhism. The above mentioned schools are also named as Vedic, otherwise known as Astika, and non-Vedic, known as Nastika schools. Carvaka is the school of ancient Indian materialism. This system is also known as Logayata, which means popular among the masses or reflecting the lay or common perspectives of reality. References to materialism are found in the epics and early Buddhist literature, but it is very difficult to trace the development of Indian materialism because a major part of the literature on materialism is now practically lost. We find only allusions to them in the works of other philosophers. Most of them are avowed critics and rivals of Carvaka system. It is believed that the priestly class of India, being annoyed by the Carvaka attack on ritualism, had destroyed all their works. There is ample reason for this belief in the light of the fact that Carvaka had little or no respect for the yajna culture prevalent in India in those days. Christian Viality, in an article in Ancient History of Encyclopedia, cites a brief poem used to condemn the priestly interest in those days. The poem runs like this: the costly rice enjoined for those who die are but means of livelihood devised by sacerdotal cunning, nothing more. While life endures, let life be spent in ease and merriment. Let a man borrow money from all his friends and feast on melted butter. The author's following remark is enough to show the reason for the opposition of the custodians of spirituality towards the Carvakas. This poem is particularly provocative if we keep in mind that butter was poured into the sacrificial fire by the Brahmin priests. Ancient Indian materialist thinkers were quite unhappy with the socio-political conditions that existed in post-Upanishadic period. But materialist thinking is as old as philosophy and human civilization. Germs of materialism are found even in the hymns of Rig Veda, which is considered as the oldest record of philosophical thinking in India. Brihaspati is regarded as the founder of Carvaka school. His sutras are not available for reference today. The Sarvadarshana Sangraha of Madhavacharya gives a summary of the teaching of the school in the first chapter. None of the systematic works of this school is extant now, except Jayasari's Tattopaplava Simha, that is written in 7th century BC, and which seems to be the summary of Brihaspati Sutras. The main sources of study about Carvaka Darshana are the allusions given in the works of other philosophers and interpreters. The main difficulty is that most of these allusions are made only to refute and attack the basic tenets of materialism. The positive aspects of this system are omitted and weak points are exaggerated by the opponents. So, it is not easy to trace a clear picture of a Carvaka school in the history of Indian philosophy. Though Madhavacharya gives a summary of Carvaka materialism in his Sarvadarshana Sangraha, his account seems to be based on the works of the rival schools of Carvakas. It is therefore very difficult to have a correct and clear picture of the basic tenets of Lokayata Darshana. In the absence of the original works, we can only depend on the one-sided accounts about Carvakas as given by their opponents. D.R. Shastri says, to quote, "It is well known to students of Indian philosophy that the original sutra works of the materialists, skeptics and agnostics of India are now lost to us. To be compelled to rely exclusively for a certain doctrine or way of thought on its presentation by its avowed opponents is not the safest way of understanding it. Opponents are seldom found free from prejudices and personal predilections. Purvapakshas or the opponent's views are almost invariably presented in an adequate and unsystematic manner, so that sound judgments as to their proper philosophical worth can be easily formed. There is no unanimous opinion about who Carvaka was. Sometimes the word denotes a proper person. Carvaka, according to some scholars, was the chief disciple of Brihaspati. Some others consider Carvaka as the name of the founder of this school, who was well known for speaking sweet words. This notion got popularity because the term Carvaka is derived from the combination of two Sanskrit words, charu and vak, which means sweet-tongued. According to still another view, Carvaka is the common name given to the materialists. Arch rivals of Carvaka materialism pictured it as a philosophy of eat, drink and be merry. Another synonym for Carvaka is Lokayata, which on the one hand reveals the popular appeal of the view and on the other marks its inferior philosophical status as the one meant for people of low and unrefined taste. References to Lokayata are found in Mahabharata, Ramayana and Manusmriti, and also in some Buddhist texts. Anyway, the existence and position of Lokayata in the history of Indian philosophy indicate the fact that there were independent thinkers and bold critics of influential spiritual views. In spite of the obvious scarcity of original materials for study, we can conclude some of the Carvaka doctrines as characteristically marking their confirmed materialist metaphysics. The first one is the Carvaka rejection of any kind of transcendental or spiritual element or category of metaphysics. This determination prompted Lokayata to focus on empirical or material reality as primary and ultimate. It is further confirmed by their unique position that the pramanas of a valid knowledge and the number and nature of the basic elements or bhutas. The Sarvadarshana Sangraha summarizes the Carvaka positions thus, to quote, "There is no heaven, no final liberation, nor any soul in another world. While the life remains, let the man live happily Let him feed on ghee, even though he runs in debt. When once the body becomes ashes, how can it ever return here? Unquote. Now we will move on to the theory of pramanas given by the Carvaka materialism. According to B.K. Mithilal, the pramana is an accredited means of knowledge on the basis of which we make assertions about what exists and what is true. In classical Indian philosophy, there are mainly four valid means of knowledge. They are sense perception or pratyaksha, inference or anumana, comparison or upamana, and verbal testimony or shabda. Of these valid means of knowledge, Carvakas accept only one, that is perception. Why perception has to be accepted is at all not explained by the Carvakas, for it also may present to us unreal or illusory knowledge. According to Carvakas, perception is necessarily for practical purpose, and for perception of everyone has to be accepted as true for that reason. The Lokayata school not only emphasizes the significance of perception or pratyaksha as the only valid means of knowledge, but also rejects the validity of all other pramanas. We know that almost all Indian schools of philosophy accept the validity of inference or anumana, but for Carvakas, even anumana is not a reliable source of knowledge because it lacks perceptual certainty or the support of the valid pramana, namely pratyaksha. Carvakas do not accept inference as a valid means of knowledge because the truth of inference depends upon the truth of the major premise. In deductive syllogism, we know that the first premise is normally a universal proposition, but according to Carvakas, perception can never give us any universal propositions. The validity of universal propositions cannot be established by our limited perception. A proposition may be true in some perceived cases, but there is no guarantee that it will hold true even in unperceived cases. Carvakas contend that deductive inference is merely an argument in circle. Since the conclusion is already contained in the major premise, the validity is not proved. Carvakas also reject the principle of causation because it is a universal law that cannot be proved by sense perception. For Carvakas, mere perception of two events which stand isolated and self-contained is not sufficient enough to establish a causal connection between them. They do not reject the formal structure of syllogism, but only its usefulness to obtain metaphysical truths. Shastri sums up the argument of Carvakas as follows. Universal propositions cannot be established by our limited perceptions. Perception presupposes actual contact of the object with the perceiving organ and is thus necessarily confined to the present. It is a case of here and now. It does not extend to the past or the future and is thus unable to establish the universal connection of things. In other words, sense perception can give us only particular truths, but the knowledge of the particular facts cannot give us knowledge that is universally true. Therefore, perception cannot give us universal relations. The major premise of a deductive argument is proved with the help of an inductive inference. But according to Carvakas, induction too does not give us correct knowledge. In our life, we often use inference and often our inferences turn out to be true. But for Carvakas, all our inferences are mere guesses. Their truth is simply accidental and never logically necessary. We can verify the results of inference only when we perceive the object of the so-called inference. But if the object of the inference is unperceivable, we cannot accept its truth. For Carvakas, comparison or upamana is equally unable to establish the universal relation, because it only establishes the relation between a name and something that bears that name. Hence, Carvaka's rejection the comparison or upamana as a source of valid knowledge. Carvaka, as they reject the validity of inference and comparison, reject verbal testimony or shabda also. For them, authority is never a reliable source of true knowledge. Any knowledge from any authority is invalid insofar as it is not proved by perception. This is the basis of the Carvaka rejection of Vedic authority on the ground that the Vedas mostly refer to objects that can never be objects of sense perception. Hence, the Vedic edicts cannot accept it as a pramana or valid means of cognition. According to Carvakas, the Vedas are unreliable because they are self-contradictory. For example, Carvakas argue that the Vedas in some places ask us not to destroy life, but in some other contexts tell us that merits of performing yajnas which involve animal sacrifice. In the Carvaka view, priestly class which had glorified the Vedic authority had the selfish motive of obtaining gifts by officiating as Vedic ceremonies. Now we pass on to the rejection of the religious precepts by Carvaka materialism. All metaphysical entities like Atman, God, heaven, etc. are unperceivable and can never be accepted as true. According to Carvakas, the transcendental categories are obviously fictitious and false because nothing beyond our sense perception exists. This is the true crux of a Carvaka criticism of the religious precepts like heaven and hell, rites and rituals, God's rewards and punishments, etc. And they were bold heretics of those days. It is this kind of uncompromising standpoints that had made Carvakas the enemies of established religions in their times and thereafter. Dr. Radhakrishnan narrates the atheistic position of Carvakas as follows. To quote, "There is no word other than this, neither heaven nor hell. These are the inventions of impostors. Religion is a foolish aberration, a mental disease. A God is not necessary to account for the world. Under the dominance of religious prejudices, men are accustomed to the idea of another world and of God. And when the religious illusion is destroyed, they feel a sense of loss and have an uncomfortable void and privation." Now we move on to the doctrine of elements in Carvaka materialism. We are familiar with the Panchabhutas theory of classical Indian metaphysics. Accordingly, the world is composed of 5 basic elements: earth or Prithvi, water or Up, fire or Tejas, air or Vayu, and ether or Akasha. According to the standard position of the Vaisheshikas, the first 4 are recognized as atomic, whereas the 5th one, namely Akasha, does not consist of material atoms. Either is an element with the distinction of being non-atomic, infinite and imperceptible. In classical Indian philosophy, in general, this theory of basic elements or bhutas explain the metaphysics of all reality. According to these, 5 elements constitute the stuff of reality, both material as well as spiritual. Carvakas wanted to maintain their materialistic stance, and therefore, they do not follow this general theory of elements. In Carvaka's scheme of basic elements, there are only four, namely earth or Prithvi, water or Up, fire or Tejas, and air or Vayu. They reject the fifth one because Akasha is characteristically non-material. By definition, it is non-atomic and imperceptible. We have seen that Carvaka do not accept the validity of any pramana other than the sense perception. Either is not real because it is not perceivable according to Carvaka, and hence they do not accept the existence of Akasha. The metaphysics or the theory of the reality of Carvaka system is perfectly in consonance with their theory of knowledge. If perception is the only reliable source of knowledge, reality can be accepted to the perceptible objects. God, soul, heaven, hell, life before and after death, etc. cannot be believed in because they are all beyond sense perception. In other words, material objects are the only objects whose existence can be perceived and whose reality can be asserted. Thus, the Carvakas establish materialism, or the theory that matter is the only reality. Now, we move on to the ethical aspects of Carvaka theory. We have seen that most of the systems of classical Indian philosophy had regarded philosophy of Lokayata as holding a quasi-metaphysical view and a negative ethical position. Many people consider the ethics of the Carvaka as a crude individual hedonism. Critics point out that of the four Purusharthas or human values, Dharma or righteousness, Artha or wealth, Kama or desires, and Moksha liberation, Carvaka accepts only Kama and sensuous pleasure, and Artha the material wealth. This outright rejection of Dharma and Moksha as unperceivable categories made them quite unpopular among both the spirituality oriented philosophers and the pious followers of a Vedic religion. Anyway, Carvakas do not regard pleasure as something to be avoided. The Carvaka argues nobody casts away the grain because of the husk, even though the pleasure is always mixed up with pain. There is no reason to keep away from pleasures. Abigail Turner, in the online article on Lokayata, explains the situation thus. The most common view among scholars regarding the ethic of Indian materialism is that it generally forwards egoism. The doctrine suggests that individuals have no obligation to promote the welfare of society and would only tend to do so if it were to ultimately benefit them as well. It is interesting to note that the Carvaka school has been maligned virtually by all schools of Indian philosophy, not merely for the rejection of supernatural, but probably more so, its insistent rejection on anything beyond egoistic ethic. Now, we will move on to a critical assessment. The philosophy of yoga is indeed unsophisticated and plain from the metaphysical point of view. This quality of simplicity may be appealing to the laity, but in philosophical circles, it is quite susceptible to harsh criticism and logical analysis. Hence, no wonder that Lokayata position has been strongly criticized by all systems of Indian philosophy. In addition to the flourish of intellectual polemics, Carvakas had to face the opposition of priestly circles towards their anti-ritualistic teaching. Faith in the validity of inference is a common point on which almost all the schools of Indian philosophy agree, but with the unilateral emphasis on pramana of sense perception, Carvaka denied the status of inference as a valid source of cognitive truth. According to the Buddhist philosophers, the Carvakas can understand others only through inference and make others understand him only through inference. Their point is that ideas cannot be perceived but only inferred. So, the Carvakas cannot refute inference. The very refutation of inference by the Carvakas is itself based on inference. Hence, the Buddhist scholars argue that Carvaka position on inference is self-refuted. Refutation of validity of inference from the empirical standpoint is the refutation of thinking and discussion. According to Nyaya philosophers, Carvaka's argument against Vyapti is pointless because Vyapti is Sopadika or with conditions. But this argument of Carvaka is itself based on inference because the knowledge of future or remote places depends not on perception but on inference. The Carvakas have refuted the existence of the cause-effect relation. The Naiyayikas argue that there is no reason for doubting the inevitability of the cause-effect relation, which is inferable from our day-to-day experiences. Without the principle of causality, even perception will be a chaos, because any cause may lead to any effect. The Carvakas do not accept any argument without conditions. Thus, their own insistence on the sole validity of pratyaksha becomes self-contradicted, as it is not without conditions. C.D. Sharma remarks about the epistemological position of Carvakas is noteworthy. He says, to quote, "Perception itself, which is regarded as valid by the Carvaka, is often found untrue. We perceive the earth as flat, but it is almost round. We perceive the earth as static, but it is moving round the sun. Such perceptual knowledge is contradicted by inference. Even though transcendental non-perception entities like God and soul, etc., are denied existence, consciousness is accepted by the Carvakas. The compounded objects may have new qualities which the components may not have. For example, betel leaf, lime and nut, none of which is originally red, come to acquire reddish tinge when chewed together. In a similar way, material elements combined in a particular way give us to conscious living body. Thus, according to the Carvakas, consciousness is an epiphenomenon or a byproduct of matter, and there is no evidence for its existence independent of the body. There is no soul apart from body, and there is no possibility of proving its immortality." Now, we conclude the session. The materialistic metaphysics of Lokayata is indeed a lone but firm position in the predominantly spiritual tradition in classical Indian philosophy. It is downgraded by critics and rival schools as a blatant heresy against the spiritualistic schools. The Carvakas did not bother the logical complexity of a philosophical system, but they tried to strengthen the doctrinal basis of popular modes of thinking. In doing this, they had raised a strong criticism against the over-enthusiasm for Karmakanda or ritualistic part of the Vedas. Hence, they had to face the attack from two quarters, the rival schools of philosophy as well as the dominant priestly class. The remark in the Encyclopedia Britannica article on Lokayata is a fingerpost to the status of the system in the classical Indian tradition. Although Carvaka doctrine had disappeared by the end of the medieval period, its one-time importance is confirmed by the lengthy attempts to refute it found in both Buddhist and Orthodox Hindu philosophical texts, which also constitute the main source of knowledge of the doctrine. Now, we can summarize the session. In this session, we have tried to explain the unique views and positions of Carvaka philosophy, which represents classical Indian materialism. According to the major Indian schools, knowledge of reality or valid cognition is called Prama, and the source of valid knowledge is called Pramana. Carvaka argue that perception is the only valid Pramana. They deny the validity of other sources of knowledge like inference and verbal testimony, which are regarded as valid Pramanas by many philosophers in Indian tradition. Another unique feature of Lokayata Darshana is the acceptance of only 4 basic elements and the rejection of Akasha, since it is imperceptible. Carvaka had challenged the common religious percepts like God, soul, heaven and hell. In most of the studies on Indian philosophy, Lokayata is very often referred to as an exception to the spiritualistic inclination of Indian systems in general. The radical positions of Carvaka were attacked both by rival systems and by the priestly class. Yet, in spite of the vehement opposition from scholars and spiritual masters from all sides, we cannot underestimate the place and role of Indian materialism as a realistic outlook closer to empiricism and positivism. Now, we give few assignments for further study. 1. Analyze the main causes of the intense criticism on Lokayata. 2. Describe the Carvaka epistemology. 3. How do Carvakas refute Anumana? Explain. 4. Causation is not valid. Explain the arguments of Carvaka. And 5. Explain why Lokayata is regarded as an obvious form of materialism. Now, we can refer to some books. Indian Philosophy, 2 volumes by Dr. S. Radhakrishnan. History of Indian Philosophy, 5 volumes by S. N. Dasgupta. Idealistic Thought of India by P. T. Raju. 6 Systems of Indian Philosophy by Max Muller. A Critical Survey of Indian Philosophy by Chandradhar Sharma. Thank you for watching this session. See you next time. Until then, bye.